The morning sun peeked through the tall windows of the Golden Spoon, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. At exactly 5:30 a.m., a young woman in her mid-twenties walked through the back entrance, her long dark hair neatly tied back in a practical bun. She carried herself with a quiet grace that seemed at odds with the simple black and white uniform she wore. The restaurant was peaceful at this hour, with only the soft hum of the kitchen equipment breaking the silence. As she began her morning routine, straightening chairs and arranging place settings, her fingers moved with an unusual precision. Each fork and knife placed with the accuracy of someone who understood timing down to the millisecond. She had graduated from one of the most prestigious music schools in the world just 2 years ago, but life had thrown her an unexpected curve. Now, instead of performing at concert halls, she memorized breakfast orders and mastered the art of balancing loaded plates. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same hands that once danced across piano keys now carried coffee pots and wiped down tables. The morning regulars started trickling in around 6:45 a.m. There was the old couple who always ordered chamomile tea with their breakfast, the businessman who liked his eggs just barely set, and the jogger who needed her smoothie extra thick. She knew all their preferences by heart, just as she once memorized Chopin's nocturnes. Between serving tables, she would sometimes catch glimpses of the grand piano that sat in the corner of the dining room. It was a beautiful instrument, its polished surface reflecting the morning light like a mirror. During quiet moments, she could almost hear the melodies in her head, the complex harmonies of Rachmaninoff, the delicate phrases of Mozart, the passionate runs of Liszt. Her fingers would twitch involuntarily, muscle memory refusing to fade despite months away from the keys. The other waiters noticed how she would occasionally pause near the piano, but they assumed she was just admiring its beauty. None of them knew about the countless hours she had spent practicing, the competitions she had won, or the standing ovations she had received. She kept those memories tucked away, like sheet music in an old folder, while she focused on perfecting her new role. Today was particularly busy, with a conference at the nearby hotel bringing in extra customers. She moved efficiently between tables, her movements as choreographed as any piano piece. A splash of coffee almost stained her uniform, but she dodged it with the same reflexes that had once helped her handle the most difficult passages in her repertoire. As the morning rush reached its peak, she maintained her composure, handling demanding customers with the same patience she once applied to mastering difficult sonatas. Deep down, she knew this wasn't her final destination. Just like a rest in a musical score, this was merely a pause in her journey, not the end of her symphony. The morning light had fully filled the restaurant now, and the breakfast rush was in full swing. She carried plates, refilled coffee cups, and smiled at customers, all while the piano in the corner waited silently. Little did anyone know that this ordinary Thursday morning would turn into something extraordinary, as fate had decided to play an unexpected note in the melody of her life. The morning had settled into its usual rhythm when the restaurant's heavy oak doors swung open, bringing with it a gust of cool air and an elderly gentleman who would change everything. He walked with deliberate steps, his silver hair neatly combed, wearing a well-tailored charcoal suit that spoke of quiet sophistication rather than flashy wealth. The hostess led him to table 7, a corner spot with a clear view of both the street and the grand piano. Our waitress approached with her usual warm smile, though something about this guest made her pause for just a fraction of a second. Perhaps it was the way his eyes seemed to take in every detail of the room, or how his fingers tapped an invisible melody on the tablecloth as he studied the menu. "Good morning," she said, pulling out her notepad. "Would you like to start with some coffee?" The gentleman looked up, his keen eyes crinkling at the corners with genuine warmth. "Tea, if you please. Earl Grey, with a slice of lemon." His voice carried the gentle authority of someone used to being listened to, yet there was nothing demanding in his tone. As she went to prepare his tea, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd seen him before. Maybe in a concert program, or perhaps on a poster somewhere. The thought nagged at her as she carefully arranged the tea service on her tray. When she returned, he was reading the morning paper, but his attention seemed divided between the headlines and the piano in the corner. She noticed how his gaze kept drifting toward the instrument, much like her own did countless times during her shifts. "Are you ready to order?" she asked, setting down his tea with practiced grace. "Ah, yes," he smiled, folding the newspaper. "The Eggs Benedict, please. And tell me, is that piano ever played?" The question caught her off guard. Most guests barely noticed the instrument, treating it like any other piece of furniture. "Only in the evenings," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "We have a pianist who comes in for dinner service." "What a shame," he mused, stirring his tea. "Such a beautiful instrument shouldn't sit silent for so long." His fingers continued their phantom dance on the tablecloth, and now she could almost recognize the pattern, the third movement of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. Throughout his meal, more guests filtered in and out of the restaurant, but this particular visitor seemed in no hurry. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, occasionally making notes in a small leather-bound notebook. Every now and then, she caught him watching the other customers with the same thoughtful attention he'd given the piano. What she didn't know was that he had been observing her too, noting how she moved with an unusual rhythm, how her posture shifted ever so slightly when she passed the piano, how her fingers sometimes twitched in patterns that no ordinary waitress would make. As the breakfast rush began to fade, he lingered over his second cup of tea. The restaurant had grown quieter, and through the open kitchen door, someone's radio played classical music, a piece by Chopin. The waitress found herself unconsciously humming along as she cleared nearby tables, not realizing that her unexpected guest was watching with growing interest. He could have been just another customer, one of the hundreds who passed through the restaurant's doors each week. But there was something about his presence that seemed to change the very atmosphere of the room, as if he had brought with him the possibility of something extraordinary. Little did anyone know that this distinguished visitor was about to set in motion a series of events that would transform their ordinary morning into something magical. The transition between breakfast and lunch always brought a peculiar calm to the Golden Spoon. Sunlight straightened through the tall windows, creating golden pools on the hardwood floor, one of which perfectly illuminated the grand piano in the corner. The instrument stood there like a sleeping giant, its polished surface reflecting the mid-morning light. During this quiet period, while her colleagues retreated to the break room or busied themselves with refilling condiments, our waitress found herself drawn to the piano as if pulled by an invisible thread. It was her daily ritual, a moment of silent communion with the instrument that represented everything she'd left behind. Today, she noticed a thin layer of dust had settled on the piano's surface. Without thinking, she pulled out her serving cloth and began to gently wipe it down. Her hands moved with practiced care, treating the instrument with the reverence it deserved. As she cleaned, memories flooded back. The smell of polish in her old teacher's studio, the weight of the keys under her fingers, the flutter in her stomach before every performance. Her fingers traced the outline of the fall board that covered the keys. Through the polished wood, she could almost feel the vibrations of music waiting to be played. How many times had she stood here, just like this, wanting nothing more than to lift that cover and let her fingers dance across the keys? The urge was particularly strong today, perhaps sparked by the presence of the mysterious gentleman who still sat at his table, writing in his little notebook. She remembered her first piano lesson at age 6, sitting on a stack of books to reach the keys properly. Her teacher had told her that a piano was like a friend who would always listen to your stories, as long as you took the time to tell them properly. Right now, she had so many stories bottled up inside, of dreams deferred, of responsibilities shouldered, of music silenced, but never forgotten. The restaurant's kitchen radio played softly in the background, a new segment replacing the classical music from earlier. The familiar sounds of dishes being washed and silverware being sorted created an unexpectedly peaceful atmosphere. A few late breakfast customers lingered over their coffee, their quiet conversations adding to the gentle murmur that filled the space. She moved around the piano, adjusting the bench's position out of habit, though she knew she wouldn't sit there. Her fingers unconsciously formed chord shapes at her side. Muscle memory that refused to fade even after months away from regular practice. In her mind, she could hear the opening notes of her favorite pieces. The delicate beginning of Debussy's Clair de Lune, the thunderous first chords of Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto No. 1. A coffee cup clinked against a saucer somewhere behind her, bringing her back to reality. She realized she'd been standing at the piano longer than usual, lost in her thoughts. The elderly gentleman was watching her with undisguised interest now, his pen hovering motionless above his notebook. Feeling self-conscious, she tucked her cleaning cloth back into her apron pocket. But before she could step away, something caught her eye. The slightest gap between the fall board and the piano's frame, revealing a sliver of those beloved black and white keys. Had it always been slightly open like that? Or was it an invitation from fate itself? The lunch rush wouldn't start for another 45 minutes, and most of the morning staff were in the back. She glanced around the dining room. Only a handful of customers remained, most engrossed in their phones or newspapers. Her fingers tingled with anticipation, and her heart began to race. After all these months of silence, after all these days of only dreaming about playing, something felt different about this ordinary Thursday morning. Something in the air seemed to whisper that perhaps it was time to let the music out, to let her secret self be heard. With trembling fingers, she lifted the fall board. The keys seemed to glow in the late morning light, like they were welcoming back an old friend. She glanced around one more time. The elderly gentleman was pretending to read his newspaper, but she could see his attention was focused on her. A few other customers continued their quiet conversations, unaware of what was about to happen. Taking a deep breath, she slowly sat down on the bench, adjusting it with the familiarity of someone who had done this thousands of times before. The smooth wood felt cool beneath her uniform dress, and her feet found the pedals naturally, like coming home after a long journey. Her hands hovered over the keys for just a moment. In that brief pause, time seemed to stand still. All the doubts, all the reasons why she shouldn't do this, floated through her mind. She could get fired, she might be rusty, people might laugh. But then her fingers touched the keys, and everything else faded away. The first notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 filled the air, soft and hesitant at first, like raindrops before a storm. The famous opening chords grew gradually, building in intensity, each one more confident than the last. Her fingers remembered every note, every subtle change in pressure, every delicate shift in timing. A coffee cup froze halfway to someone's lips. A newspaper lowered. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath as the music swelled, filling every corner of the room with its rich, emotional depth. Her body swayed gently with the music, years of training taking over. The morning sunlight caught the slight sheen of tears in her eyes, but her fingers never faltered. Each phrase flowed into the next with the natural grace of a river finding its path to the sea. The piano, which had sat silent for so many mornings, sang under her touch as if it too had been waiting for this moment. In the kitchen, staff members poked their heads through the door, drawn by the unexpected concert. The dishwasher's radio was quickly turned off, leaving only the sound of the piano filling the space. Even the street noise seemed to quiet down, as if the outside world was paying respect to this unexpected burst of beauty. She played with the passion of someone who had been keeping music bottled up inside for too long. Every emotion she'd suppressed over the past months poured out through her fingers. The joy of creating something beautiful, the pain of giving up her dreams, the hope that still burned quietly in her heart. The elderly gentleman had completely abandoned any pretense of reading his newspaper now. He sat completely still, his eyes closed, a small smile playing on his lips. Other customers had turned their chairs to watch, some wiping tears from their eyes, others sitting in stunned silence. As she approached the piece's famous climax, her fingers danced across the keys with increasing intensity. The music swelled and soared, filling the restaurant with wave after wave of powerful emotion. The piano responded to her every touch, from the gentlest pianissimo to the most thunderous forte, as if it had been waiting all this time just for her. Time seemed to lose all meaning. The breakfast dishes on the tables, the half-empty coffee cups, her waiting uniform. All of these details of her daily life faded into the background. In this moment, she wasn't a waitress anymore. She was what she had always been, a musician, an artist, a storyteller in the language of music. As the final notes faded away, there was a moment of complete silence. It was the kind of silence that follows something extraordinary, when people need a moment to process what they've just experienced. Then, from somewhere in the back of the restaurant, someone started clapping. The applause spread quickly, growing into a thunderous standing ovation that seemed to shake the very walls of the Golden Spoon. The applause seemed to go on forever, filling the restaurant with waves of appreciation. As our waitress stood up from the piano bench, her legs slightly shaky, she noticed that nearly everyone in the restaurant was on their feet. Some were wiping tears from their eyes, while others were simply staring in amazement, their breakfast forgotten on their plates. The elderly gentleman was the first to approach her, his eyes bright with an intensity that hadn't been there before. His dignified demeanor had transformed into barely contained excitement as he made his way across the restaurant floor. The other customers parted to let him through, sensing something important was about to happen. "That was extraordinary," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite its softness. "Your interpretation of Rachmaninoff. I haven't heard anything like it since I attended the Moscow Conservatory's centennial performance." He paused, studying her face carefully. "You were trained at Juilliard, weren't you? Class of 2022. She felt her heart skip a beat. How could he possibly know that? The question must have shown on her face because he smiled gently and continued, "I never forget a musician of your caliber. I was there for the winter showcase. You performed Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2. It was magnificent then, just as your playing is magnificent now." Other customers had gathered around them now, forming a respectful semicircle. Someone from the kitchen had called the restaurant owner, who stood in the doorway looking both confused and amazed. A young girl tugged at her mother's sleeve, whispering loudly, "Mom, she plays better than my piano teacher." The elderly gentleman reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. The simple white card seemed to glow in the morning light as he held it out to her. "I should introduce myself properly. I've spent the last 40 years discovering and nurturing musical talent. Currently, I'm preparing for a series of charity concerts featuring both established and emerging artists." Her hands were still trembling slightly as she took the card. The simple black text identified him as one of the most respected figures in classical music, a man known for launching countless careers and shaping the future of classical performance. She had read about him in music magazines and seen his name in concert programs, never imagining their paths would cross in this unexpected way. "But why are you?" she began, gesturing at her waitress uniform, unable to finish the question that everyone was thinking. He smiled warmly. "Sometimes life takes unexpected turns. What matters is not where we are, but where our passion leads us. And your passion, my dear, is undeniable. The way you played that Rachmaninoff, it wasn't just technically perfect, it had soul. You told a story through those keys." The other customers nodded in agreement. An older woman who had been sitting near the piano spoke up, her voice thick with emotion. "I've never cared much for classical music, but what you just played, it made me feel things I can't even describe." The restaurant owner had made his way through the crowd by now. His face showed a mix of emotions, surprise, admiration, and perhaps a touch of embarrassment at not knowing the talent that had been serving coffee in his establishment all these months. The elderly gentleman turned to address the owner directly. "You have been unknowingly hosting one of the finest young pianists I've heard in the past decade. I hope you realize what a gift you've had in your midst." His words carried no judgment, only a gentle acknowledgement of an overlooked truth. The morning sun had risen higher now, casting new shadows across the restaurant floor. The piano stood in its corner, its polished surface reflecting the light differently somehow, as if it too had been transformed by the music it had just produced. In this moment, surrounded by applauding strangers who had become an impromptu audience, our waitress felt something shift inside her. A realization that perhaps dreams don't die, they just wait for the right moment to reawaken. The restaurant owner led everyone to a quiet corner of the dining room, pulling together several tables to accommodate the impromptu gathering. The morning sun had shifted, casting long, gentle shadows across the wooden floor. The elderly gentleman sat at the head of the table, while our waitress, still in her uniform, but somehow looking different now, took a seat beside him. "Tell us," he said softly, "how does someone with your extraordinary talent end up here?" His voice held no judgment, only genuine curiosity and compassion. The other customers leaned in slightly, equally intrigued by the story about to unfold. She took a deep breath, her fingers absently tracing patterns on the tablecloth as if playing an invisible piano. 2 years ago, I was preparing for my debut with the symphony orchestra," she began, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. Everything I'd worked for was finally falling into place. The restaurant had grown completely quiet, even the kitchen staff had gathered at the edges of the room to listen. A pot clattered somewhere in the background, but nobody turned to look. All eyes were on the young woman who had just transformed their ordinary morning into something magical. "Then my mother got sick," she continued, her voice softening. "The doctors said she needed specialized treatment. The medical bills." She paused, collecting herself. "I had a choice to make. The money I'd saved for my career went to her treatment instead. I came back home to help, took this job to make ends meet. The plan was always to return to music eventually. But—" the elderly gentleman nodded understanding. "But life has a way of turning temporary solutions into permanent situations," he finished for her. She looked up at him, grateful for his understanding. The restaurant owner, who had been standing quietly nearby, suddenly spoke up. "I had no idea," he said, shaking his head. "All these months, you've been here, serving coffee, dealing with demanding customers. Why didn't you ever mention your background?" A soft smile crossed her face. "Would it have made a difference?" she asked gently. "I needed the job, and you needed a reliable waitress. Besides," she glanced toward the piano, "being near a piano every day, even if I couldn't play it, it helped keep the dream alive." An older couple who had been regular breakfast customers for years reached across the table to pat her hand. "We've been coming here every morning for so long," the woman said, "and you've always been so kind, so attentive. To think you were carrying this gift inside you all this time." The elderly gentleman pulled out his leather notebook, flipping through its pages with purpose. "Your mother," he said, looking up, "how is she now?" "Better," she replied, a smile of relief crossing her face. "The treatment worked. She's been in remission for 6 months." He nodded, making a note in his book. "And your practice routine? Have you been able to maintain it at all?" She glanced down at her hands that had grown more accustomed to carrying plates than playing concertos. "There's a small piano at the community center. They let me practice there sometimes, late in the evenings after my shift. It's not quite the same as having my own instrument, but you've kept your skills sharp," he finished, gesturing toward the restaurant's piano. "That much is obvious from what we just heard. Rachmaninoff isn't exactly something you can pull off without regular practice." The morning light had brightened now, and the lunch crowd would be arriving soon. Yet no one moved to leave. They all sat there, caught in this extraordinary moment, watching as years of hidden talent and suppressed dreams finally found their voice. The piano stood silently in its corner, but now it seemed to hold a new promise, not just of music to come, but of dreams reawakened and hope renewed. The elderly gentleman leaned forward, his eyes twinkling with purpose. In exactly 3 weeks, he began, "We're holding a charity concert at the Grand Concert Hall. Some of the finest musicians in the country will be performing." He paused, letting his words sink in. "We had a pianist withdraw due to personal reasons. I believe that space was meant for you." The restaurant fell completely silent. Even the clinking of dishes from the kitchen seemed to pause, as if the whole building was holding its breath. Our waitress sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes wide with disbelief. But I haven't performed professionally in 2 years," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "And the Grand Concert Hall, that's exactly where you belong," the gentleman finished firmly. "What we heard today wasn't just skill. It was pure passion, the kind that can't be taught or manufactured, the kind that moves people's hearts." The restaurant owner, who had been quietly listening, suddenly stepped forward. "Use the piano," he said, gesturing toward the instrument. "Practice here whenever you want. Before opening, after closing, during the quiet hours, whatever you need." He smiled warmly. "Consider it my apology for not asking about your background sooner." A young couple who had witnessed the whole thing spoke up from their table. "We'll buy tickets to the concert," they said enthusiastically. "Front row if we can get them." Other customers nodded in agreement, already pulling out their phones to mark the date. The elderly gentleman pulled out another card from his pocket, this one larger, cream-colored, with gold lettering. "This is the contact information for my personal assistant. She'll help arrange everything: rehearsal schedules, publicity, wardrobe." He smiled at her stunned expression. "All you need to do is say yes." Tears welled up in her eyes, but these were different from the ones she'd shed while playing earlier. These were tears of joy, of relief, of dreams being reborn. I need to call my mother," she managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. "Of course," the gentleman nodded. "Family should always be the first to know. In fact," he paused, making another note in his book, "we'll arrange for front row tickets for her too. Nothing better than having your biggest supporter there on your big night." The morning sunlight had shifted again, now falling directly on the piano keys, making them gleam like they were made of pure gold. The breakfast dishes had long since been cleared away, and the lunch menu boards were being set up, but nobody seemed to care about the usual routine anymore. "There's just one more thing," the restaurant owner added, a gentle smile playing on his lips. "Would you consider being our regular evening pianist? Not as a waitress who plays, but as a resident musician." He gestured around the room. "I think our customers would appreciate having dinner with a side of world-class piano music." The other staff members, who had gathered nearby, broke into spontaneous applause. The cook shouted from the kitchen, "As long as you still visit us back here sometimes," causing everyone to laugh. Looking around the room at all these faces, people who just an hour ago had been strangers, but now felt like family, she felt something settle in her heart. The weight of hidden dreams and suppressed talent lifted from her shoulders, replaced by the warmth of possibility and hope. Standing up, she walked over to the piano, running her fingers lightly across its polished surface. This morning, she'd have been a waitress who once played piano. Now she was a pianist who had been temporarily serving tables. The difference might seem subtle, but it meant everything. Sometimes life's most beautiful melodies come from its most unexpected moments, and the best performances aren't always on the grandest stages. Sometimes they happen in a simple restaurant, on an ordinary Thursday morning, when someone finally finds the courage to let their true self shine.